Hey guys, my name is Emilis, and today I'll be talking about the creation of this image using Clarisse and Photoshop. So first of all, just a little bit about myself. I've been a digital matte painter slash environment generalist at DNEG for the past 3 years, and DNEG does quite a lot of cool large-scale work using Clarisse, and as soon as I arrived I realized that I would kind of be interested in learning a little bit of that myself. And so over the past maybe year or two, wherever I've been able to, I've been trying to squeeze in as much Clarisse practice as I can. And so far, I've been able to complete 3 projects. And I'll quickly talk about how Clarisse helped me improve as an artist and allowed me to push my ideas further than I'd been able to previously. And how with each of these projects, I learned a few more techniques that helped me create large-scale environments. So my first project using Clarisse, I only used the software minimally and only kind of did the very simplest scattering setups and kind of manually placed a lot of the geometry and did most of the work in Photoshop when I came to the stage where I overpainted everything and really got it working there. And while that is a workflow that works quite well, I kind of found that later on I was able to push Clarisse more in terms of just the renders that I'd be able to get out of it and create, more interesting scattering setups that kind of held up just by themselves without any need to overpaint. And so over the next couple of images, I'm going to show how I was able to increase my use of Clarisse and decrease my overall time spent per project. So the next project I did, I kind of just practiced a lot with creating scattering setups, using decimation and sampling maps, and really seeing how far I can push the software to towards the final image without needing to do much overpainting. So while this is a project of a much smaller scale, it kind of showed me that I could do much more of the work within Clarisse and much more quickly than otherwise. And so with my third Clarisse project, I was able to get most of the way there with just the render from 3D. And I still did a bunch of overpainting, but it was all just kind of finishing touches on an already working project. So it was just the little details and some wires, that kind of thing that I painted over. But overall, I was able to get the entire image working within Clarisse first, and the entire project maybe took me 10 days worth of evenings and weekends. So I was quite happy with the result, and for my new project I wanted to see how far I could push that maybe even further to see, if I could really shorten my personal project times. So I created this image using a combination of Clarisse and Photoshop, and I'm going to talk about how the main advantage of Clarisse versus other softwares is how much you can achieve with minimal time spent in 3D before you switch to overpainting, but already having a great result. The main thing I see everyone kind of commenting about when the talk of personal work comes up at the workplace is that no one has much time to do anything at home because, they're either too tired after work or just it's hard to squeeze any time in overall. So I think having the ability to create large level or large scale scenes in a quick period of time is kind of helpful because, you can spend a lot of time just on the creative aspects of the image without getting bogged down in the minutiae of, having to place everything down by yourself and having to texture everything yourself, and you're able to just spend more time creating things and coming up with ideas, which I think is the main way to keep personal work fun. I was able to create this image with a bit less than 2 weeks of work, and I used a combination of scattering, being able to clone stamp objects, particle painting, and hand placement of little bespoke touches of geo in order to create the overall layout. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of every single technique. While I will discuss and show little examples of everything, I feel like other people have already created better tutorials than I have for those techniques, and if you go onto the Isotropics YouTube page, you will be able to find tutorials on almost every single tool that I could think of using. So I will explain the concepts and everyone can feel free to look up the tools if anything is unclear, but genuinely, this is created using all of the basic techniques, but nothing too complicated. And really, it's just kind of the logic behind my work that I think counts more for than the actual description of the tools and techniques. And I will kind of discuss my general ways of thinking and methods of kind of going about creating these images instead of going into the nitty-gritty. So here's a simple example of how I often go about generating ideas in Clarisse. I tend to just scatter a lot of points and see what I get and really look for happy accidents. And I go into the creation of the image sometimes without even having a solid idea for what I want to do, but by creating a lot of random shapes and sort of going through them, you can see a lot of things that you wouldn't have even thought of yourself, and that's sometimes kind of cool, especially if you have no brief. You can really use this as a basis for finding cool ideas that otherwise you never even would have thought of. And this is really the closest equivalent I have to I guess the ability to speed paint in Photoshop when it comes to 3D environments. Really, I'm able to create this incredible amount of detail and then fly through and look for cool compositions, look for cool ideas, and then whenever I like something, I just drop down a camera, find a new place, and I do a lot of this at the start, and then maybe at some point commit to something that I think can work. But you can get a lot of cool ideas for free using this method. And here are the pieces of Kitbash geometry that I use to scatter all over my base geo. I was looking for shapes that could be interpreted as buildings or some sort of structures without having too much unnecessary detail. So after playing around with the basic layout in Clarisse, I ended up with this. And with this layout, I was kind of aiming for some kind of a cave city environment, and really the idea just came to me upon seeing the specific layout within Clarisse, and I added, a bit of ground to kind of help sell myself the idea. And at this stage, I'm literally just trying to find something to latch onto, some idea, and the scattering of various sort of slightly detailed geometries really helps me kind of see a lot of detail. And even though I don't care about the specific detail that I'm looking at, it helps me kind of visualize what it could be. So the end result of this project was quite different, but just this kind of density of detail allows me to imagine all of these little pieces as buildings or something like that, and really helps me latch my mind onto some idea. And so when I'm kind of happy with the render I've got, and I put in like a little bit of light, try to sculpt something with light just to kind of catch the viewer's attention, I tend to bring this image into Photoshop and kind of, I don't know, flip it a few times, see what works. Already I'm kind of trying to see, okay, if this is my rule of thirds, I could have some kind of a focal point here, and maybe something interesting happening here, and then maybe something here, and I kind of try to like bring the attention of the viewer from the outside into the inside of the image, and sort of played around with that idea. And kind of sketching things out a little bit helped me I don't know, cycle through different kind of thoughts that I wouldn't have had otherwise, maybe just sitting in 3D, right? And while I'm in Photoshop, I tend to kind of also flip the image a lot, see maybe, I can see some more interesting compositions flipping it in different directions. And actually with this image, that's exactly what happened. I kind of landed upon this and thought, you know what, this could look like a much cooler concept if I just flipped the whole thing upside down. And I feel like I wouldn't have done that if I had just worked in 3D, but going into Photoshop and quickly kind of blocking different ideas out and doing things like that helps you maybe think of things that you wouldn't have even thought previously, even though, what you already received from the scattering were happy accidents that, already wouldn't have entered into your psyche, right? Okay, so I went back into Clarisse after doing those little sketches and actually adjusted my layout to work upside down. And some of the pieces I kind of flipped, some of them I moved, some I kept in place, and maybe just adjusted minimally, but basically now I've ended up with a physically correct version of what I had achieved in Photoshop by just flipping it, but I'm already kind of liking the idea at this stage. So while at this stage I'm not yet committed to any of the small details within the image because they're still subject to change, I am quite happy with the major blocking that I have, and I'm at this stage starting to think a little bit modularly regarding how I can split apart these huge structures into their own separate contexts, just so I have more control when it comes to the point clouds and the scattering later on. And so my logic is to kind of split the foreground and the midground objects apart just by themselves, because I will want to be scattering much more detail on them. And for things like, say, the background or the far midground, I can block together a much larger piece of the city because I will not be scattering as much detail on them, and thus I can afford for them to be a little bit more loose, and I'm not going to be spending as much time working on them. But I really want that detail when it comes to the foreground. So I think doing this is really good in the long run, because otherwise you come to the point when your scene file is just far too huge and you're kind of starting to get lost in it a little bit. But if you do this, it's much easier to just disable the parts of the image that you don't want and work on only what you need and want at that exact moment. So at this stage within Clarisse, one of the main things I'm looking out for are opportunities to sculpt things and to model things using light. And so I play around a lot with adding, directional lights, changing the rotations, maybe adding light blockers to kind of block out light out of places where I don't want it, and really take the opportunity to enhance the kind of angles and perspectives that I would like to see in this image, and bring in focus to the parts of the image that I want, and really thinking of ways that I can lead the user's eye, or the viewer's eye rather, across the image to my desired focal point. And I know that later on in the creation of this image I will be adding a lot of haze, which I've represented here with a simple depth pass, as well as waterfalls and clouds and things like that. So I want to take the opportunity to use the light and shadows to really sculpt out silhouettes in the distance, in order to kind of get that detail still in the image, even though it is literally just blocks of shape or blocks of color. So, if I don't want any of that detail later on, I can always throw it away with a bit of extra haze, but it's nice to have all of that sort of skyline detail brought out. One of my favorite things to do while creating an image is to bring it into Photoshop and really just paint over the rough render that I have, and really try to come up with new ideas on the spot without having to spend any time or effort on them at all. And what I already have out of Clarisse is a lot of detail that I don't really care about. It's nice to have all of it, and it kind of represents what I want to see, but I can throw away and change large chunks of it without feeling bad, because I didn't really commit to any of it and I didn't spend time on it. So it's kind of, again, like doing a little bit of speed painting, where I can change a lot of these details, which in other software packages would take quite a while to do, and not feel bad about it at all, because I'm just after the concept itself and I haven't wasted any time. So when I bring it into Photoshop, I sometimes play around with adding in, kind of like atmospheric effects and structures that I think, could look a little bit more bespoke, a little bit more man-made, and really bring life to the city. And I'm kind of thinking of an architectural style that I'd really like to explore, and focal points and kind of ideas for what could the hooks of this image be. Because as nice as it is to have a lot of scattering, you kind of have to think about ways that you can bring the human touch to it and really, separate it from every other CG image out there. And as I'm hopping back and forth between the two software packages, I really try to iron out the kinks by using them in conjunction. So, I'll notice the mistakes in Photoshop and then jump into Clarisse and fix them, make a new render, again, jump back into Photoshop, see what's working, see what's not working. So, for example, this was one of the stages of my working process. And at this stage, I was kind of happy with the main outline I had, but there were some bits that bothered me. For example, the scattering here has kind of turned out a little bit weird, and that this is some unidentifiable shape that I don't really want. It brings kind of chaos to the image, and I feel like I could really simplify it. Again, here I felt like I could have done with more empty space maybe instead of this building. For example, here I felt like these shapes were a little bit too repetitive, and I kind of always find it helpful to, go into Photoshop and identify these mistakes, note them down for yourself, and then jump back into Clarisse and fix them. And you do that enough times, and you kind of iron out all of the bugs that otherwise might have slipped past you if you didn't take these little minutes here and there to really take a step back and look at the image as a whole. So after some back and forth between Clarisse and Photoshop, I decide that the layout is now starting to be looking pretty good, and I'm quite happy with it overall. One of the main tools that I use to make all of these adjustments is the ability to scale instances individually by breaking down the point cloud, and this is really helpful when you have just some little bits that, for example, this used to be much more jetted out, and you need to kind of just align it slightly to what you want to be seeing, and it's a great way to fix all of the final mistakes. Overall, my kind of thinking is to lead the viewer's eye across all of these levels of the image, ranging from the foreground to the midground to the background, and I'm kind of trying to really concentrate on this main area by having all of the lines sort of spread out around it. It almost kind of looks like coming from this way we have this angle of view, and then we can see things this way, and the focal point ends up here, and that's sort of what I've been trying to do by changing all of these main forms, and same with the foreground, sort of eye hopping from here to here to here, and then along these lines as well. Here is my bespoke geometry. I have a lot of this from a couple of previous projects, so I didn't do too much modeling just for this project, but I'm quite happy with the variety of buildings that I've got here, and none of them are very complicated really. I'm not a master modeler by any means, and I kind of always try to think of what resolution these buildings will be seen at on screen, so I tend to not go too overboard with just the modeling process. So this is a quick example showing a very easy setup of a decimation texture or a sampling texture, which I used a lot when scattering all of my objects on top of the base pieces of the city, so things like shanties, the balconies, and the trees. I didn't really go into too much detail with any of these setups because I was just still aiming to get all of the main parts of the image working, and I knew that for all of the little imperfections and tiny little details I could do that in DMP. And so with this I was really aiming to just get quick setups that work really well, and Clarisse is perfect for that because these don't take any particular skill to learn, and I'm not a very technical artist, but you can do this and a lot more, and you can combine a lot of these techniques to sort of add a little bit more originality and variety to your scattering setups, as opposed to having just everything be scattered without any rules or anything like that. So what I kind of tend to do is when working with these maps, because obviously my main scene is a lot heavier than this, I tend to create a separate image and preview all of these decimation setups using a matte shader, and this is a really quick and easy way to see what you're doing and not get bogged down sort of changing settings and waiting for all of your scattering setups to refresh. So here's the image with some smaller objects scattered on the large blocks. I played around with having some shanties, having some balconies, having some trees, some temples, and really trying to iron out the idea of the kind of city I want this to be, and really trying to commit to an actual look, whereas previously what I had was quite random and quite loose. And I think there's some already quite interesting things that I'm seeing with just a bunch of basic scattering. I think there's cool potential for this whole area. I think something cool could be brought out here, but the one thing I'm really unhappy with is this entire block, because I would say it's perhaps the second most focal point of the image after this area, and nothing really interesting is going on here. There's a bunch of scattering, but this is where I feel like I'm gonna need to bring in some more bespoke detailing, because at the minute nothing here makes me think that any viewer will be interested in spending more than a few seconds looking at. And I think I could really use this kind of area to tell a story or convey some sort of an idea, or really, interest the viewers, and this is not cutting it. So again, I've done a little concept sketch over the top of my render just to see where I could take this image. And this is where I really started playing around and coming up with a lot of these ideas that did make it into the final image. I came up with these kind of pier areas, which I replicated pretty closely later on. I kind of thought it would be really cool to add some kind of monsoon idea, like the city has just gone through a huge bout of rainfall and everything is dripping. I thought maybe some vehicles could add a lot as well to the image. Played up the main focal point a little bit just to see, what kind of cool architecture I could bring out here that would really draw the viewer's attention. And mostly of all, I tried to see how I could rework this block. This isn't exactly what I ended up in the final image, but I think this was a good way to start talking about this idea with myself in my own mind and trying to see what I could come up with. I kind of thought this could be something that draws the attention up throughout the building. Some cool area could be appearing here, and I could really try to push some kind of a narrative with this. So again, I jump back into Clarisse and make those changes and more. So now I've kind of played around more with defining this area, seeing what I can come up with here that is more bespoke. I've really adjusted the scale of a lot of the things to make the image work slightly better with the kind of elements I'm having here, and I'm really conscious of not having anything that looks like it's out of proportion. So I'm not individually checking every item, but I'm comparing them against each other before I scatter them, and just seeing that everything I have is more or less consistent. A lot of the areas still to work up that don't make sense, but I can see the image forming, and I really start to play around with having a combination of just general scatterers for the background, and then areas where I hand place some objects and particle paint other objects on top and clone stamp other objects on top to really add more attention to detail to this area and kind of not waste it and have something that makes sense on a human level. While you could come up with really fancy scattering setups where they kind of would replicate this, I think for an image, for your own personal work, when you don't want to spend too much time on it, this is the area where you kind of got to take that opportunity to quickly particle paint some buildings, some trees, things like that. And it's quite a lot of fun. It's a little bit like speed painting. You're painting geometry directly onto the image, and it really doesn't take that long, and add a few hand-placed objects, and it's really easy to hide the kind of connection between where you've scattered things manually and automatically. This is my final layout in Clarisse, and I'm quite happy with it overall. I've evened out the scale, I've evened out the distribution of detail. Previously, when I kind of made things slightly larger, I found that it was nice to slightly reduce the amount of points scattered in order to not overcrowd the image. And overall, I'm quite happy with both the lighting and the layout. And so the main point so far is that it's good to spend a little bit of time not completely committing to the image and just playing around with the basic shapes, and then once you do commit, being able to use a wide range of different methods in order to achieve what you want with the smallest amount of effort required and the most efficient way, especially for personal work where you don't want to spend too much time chugging along using some slow method of doing things. I think this is very important, and I think it's a great way not to get bogged down in big projects and being able to really kind of get all of these things blocked out so quick using whatever fastest technique you can is the best way to work, I think, if you don't want to go insane. So here is a render which shows in color where I scattered things using point clouds and where I particle painted and clone stamped objects and where I manually placed them. So everything that is green has been scattered using point clouds. I did create some rules for decimation and for sampling based on normals, based on distance to UVs, things like that, just to have the detail make some sort of sense. But overall it's quite random. Everything that is blue has been painted by hand, but using particle painters or clone stamp tool. And this is where I kind of tried to have detail where I didn't care too much about it individually, but just wanted kind of areas where I had a lot of stuff going on and kind of how I wanted it, just to make sure I had that extra control. And then everything that is red has been manually hand placed, and these are kind of the main, I guess, story points of the image, things like that, where I really wanted to bring out the architecture, where I wanted to bring out the story and really draw the viewer's attention. Meanwhile, with this image, I'm wanting to show you guys where I split things apart in terms of modularity. I split out, these foreground buildings separately, these kind of main areas near the ground, and then as you can see, the further you go into the city, the larger these chunks of the city become when grouped together. And I think from distance onwards, I didn't even scatter any detail automatically, just to conserve a little bit of memory and not waste all of that rendering time on things that I didn't really need. So splitting everything apart also makes it easier for me to track things whenever I'm needing to make changes. It makes things less confusing, and I think it's a good way to work if you have a little bit of time just to set everything up like that. So here are my final renders from Clarisse. Starting off with just the basic environment light render. I always want to have this as my base, so I have something constant to work from. This, in conjunction with the directional light render, are my only two lighting renders, and that's literally just all the lights that I had. I want to keep this directional light render separate so that I have more control over each of the patches of light. I can bring some of them up and emphasize them. I can de-emphasize others. After this, I have my ambient occlusion render. This is great for sharpening up some of the edges in the final image, as well as using this as a mask for adding detail in all the crevasses and on the edges, things like that. Of course, my Z-depth, which I use to sculpt and bring out all of the shapes of the haze and the clouds and the waterfalls that I add later by adjusting sort of the brightness and contrast of this render. I also have a volumetric lighting render. This is really quick, coming out of Clarisse. You just put in a volume over your city and add a light, and it calculates this really quickly and efficiently, and it adds a lot of realism to your final image, even if you just have this on at a slight opacity. So when it comes to texturing, I find that with large-scale environments such as this, it's much more efficient in terms of time to not texture everything, and by that I mean not to texture every single object separately. I find that instead just using a lot of triplanar textures and applying them to absolutely everything seems to be the quickest and most efficient way of working, because then you can take these and take rendered out masks from all of your ID passes and just cherry pick where you want each of the textures. So here I've rendered out all of the main kind of materials that I could think of, including wood and grass and gold and marble and different types of brick and stone. And I drew inspiration for these from some travel photos that I've had from India, and basically I just took chunks of the wall textures, things like that, and made sure they were seamless, which is really simple to do, and apply them over absolutely everything at several different scales as well, just so I'd have more to play with and really kind of be able to cherry pick out the best little nuggets of textures for each individual piece where I think they catch the light in the best way, or draw the attention in the best way. So here are all of the ID passes that I've rendered out, and they're all RGB, but I just color corrected them so I could fit them all into this one image. But basically, I'm able to then use all of these little masks by just isolating the specific channels in Photoshop in order to apply all of my textures. So what I will do is select, say, all of the balconies or all of the shanties and apply one texture, and then apply a different texture to different things. And because all of the triplanar textures are correct along all of the normals of the entire city, I get really quick, really sort of almost free detail, and I'm still able to have a lot of control over it. So in addition to all of those IDs, I also render out a normal map render, so I'm able to isolate all of the faces facing in Y or in X or in Z, and so I'm able to add, say, grass on top of buildings or grime on the walls, things like that. And by multiplying these masks together with these, I'm able to kind of achieve pretty good results without even having to do any manual painting. For certain objects, such as the shanties and the balconies, I actually elected to make some really simple textures of just very low resolution images of shanty walls and shanty rooftops, and then kind of randomizing those for every object within the scatterer. So I actually get loads of detail this way by doing very little work, and I kind of made a couple of these passes and again cherry picked where I wanted specific details, where I thought a specific tarp or a specific pattern on the wall worked quite well. And so I think for a project like this, texturing everything manually would be quite a lot of work, because the results you would get from that would be rather delayed, in that you would spend a lot of time just working on individual assets instead of working on the image. And for me, the image is the key here, so I want to work on everything at once if possible, and kind of deal with the minutiae later and not waste my time with every single object when a lot of them might not even be visible later on. So this might not be the perfect pipeline for a company or for a huge project, but seeing as I'm talking about personal work, I see no reason not to speed things up this way. Okay, so let's quickly talk about good practices in Photoshop when putting the image together. I always tend to start with my environment light right at the bottom, and I apply my directional light over it, over the top, and I use the color dodge blending mode here, but there's a few of them that you could play around for different results. This is kind of what I found to work for this image. And above that I add my ambient occlusion and I add my depth. And so in between my two lights I add my water, which is just a simple water texture with a few different textures of ponds, things like that, applied over the top, where I kind of use them to bring out some of this pure detail, but overall I'm not really aiming to draw the attention, just sort of add some life to it. And then I add all of my triplanar textures also in between these two lights, and I've set them all to the overlay blending mode here, but again you can play around with different ones for different results. And so as you can see, I tend to use my ID passes, like for example here I think I used everything except the up facing normals, just to isolate where my textures are applied. And I play around with a lot of these and apply different masks to them and kind of stack them on top of each other and see how that all works out. For example, here for grass I used the inverted ambient occlusion map just to get all of the edges, and liberally put it in all of them, and then also later on painted on some more grass using kind of just some brush strokes to get like the bespoke look that I wanted of a slightly overgrown city. And I play around a lot with these. There's really infinite variations that you could go for, and I'm constantly using my ideas from earlier to make all of these work. So if I go to the top of my layer stack here, I have all of my IDs, and these are always helpful to have right in your image. And I always try to make sure that I render everything that I can, but I still somehow manage to forget a few of these and have to go back into Clarisse and render them out midway through working in Photoshop. And so if I go into my channels here, I can, for example, select the blue channel, and this will select all of the shanties that are blue within this ID pass. And then, for example, I can go into my alpha mask here for one of these triplanar layers and apply this texture to all of the shanties. And so you can see differences happening. And this is a pretty versatile way of working because you're not committing to anything, and all of this is completely easy to adjust later on, and I do go back in a lot of times to do that. My gold shader I've kept separate, unlike all the triplanars which I added as an overlay blending mode over the environment base. The gold has some spec response that I built into that shader, so I wanted to kind of keep that without just overlaying it, so I've kept this separate on the normal blending mode and just applied it to the domes, where I kind of tried to bring attention across the image as the eye travels towards this huge dome in the background, and I thought they were a nice way to sort of add a little bit of differentiation amongst the otherwise dull textures. So after this, one of the main things to consider is how far do you want to push just the textures that you've made with triplanars, and how far they can get you before you could start adding some overpainted textures. And with those, it's really all about just adding tiny little details here to add scale and add people, add life. But overall, I'm 90% of the way there. But again, it's the last 10% that is half the work, right? So here I've painted in a lot of these little tarps and things like that, and my kind of thinking with this was that basically I had these reference images which I took from an airplane over Mumbai, and they had a lot of these great little details which I felt like they held up in a lot of different ways. I thought, you know, these could be tarps, these could be rooftops, these could be little cloths hanging around. I could always, you know, change the hue and get entirely different colors and really mix it up, and they're just a nice little mindless detail that I didn't really care about clarifying, but just wanted to add just to emphasize the life in the city. And this is sort of where I kind of made my decision to not do this with scattering, but rather do it in DMP, because I felt like at this stage this would have been too much work to kind of set up the decimation and the sampling rules in 3D and kind of getting all of these little details. I just felt like in DMP at this stage it was quicker. So the way I kind of handle this is I grab the image that I want, and with this kind of mindless detail it's very easy to isolate it, especially if it stands out from the rest of the image. So for example, I just want the blue tarps, things like that, and I can just isolate the shadows and only keep the highlights. And so I've got this now, right? And so if I create a layer under it and merge this down, I've now got this with its own mask, and I didn't even put any effort into cutting anything out. So it's a very quick and efficient way to get free detail, and you know, then I can grab bits that I like and, you know, add them wherever I want over the image. And that's exactly kind of what I've done with all of these around the entire image. And really is just from these 3 or 4 reference photos that I've got. Apart from that, there's really not much going on. So one important thing to take into consideration is to keep the lighting consistent between your 3D render and your overpainted bits. So here actually none of these details that I've added respond to the light and shadow from the renders. So that's sort of something you have to add on top, and I kind of do it in a couple of different ways. For example, here I've got a curves that creates, well, basically a shadow, and I've taken one of the lighting renders and just kind of played around with it. So these shadows would only be applied to the dark areas from within the lighting render, and then on top of that, I've also added another all-purpose shadowing color correction layer. And so I've split these overpainting layers into kind of the different categories of what they are. So here I was painting over the top just to get an extra detail into here. And in the same way that I added all of these little city details, in order to add more life, I added cutouts of people. And frankly, this was just from well, some previous people that I cut out, some that I've found in free images on Google, things like that. And really, I'm just kind of trying to use them to add scale and add sort of bustle to the city so it doesn't look dead. And again, I'm trying to think of where they should be shadowed, where they should be lit. And I'm really not trying to draw any attention to them, but just have that as an extra detail that people could notice. And same with boats as well. I added a bunch of boats, try to add some directionality to the image, and again, focal points here where I've got a little bit of light. I've kind of tried to, add some kind of action so that people might be interested in looking here after seeing the main focal points of the image. And so one more thing to talk about here would be my work with Z-depth. And what I tend to do is apply just the basic depth that I get out of the box, and then also make a lot of copies of it and basically make individualized little bits of fog where I just select certain parts of the image where I want to paint it and kind of, increase or decrease fog in that one little area. And I'm always using the depth itself as a mask. So for example, here, if I go into my blending options and into the blend if settings, for example, I can key out the shadows or the highlights of the fog, and basically this works because this is a depth layer, and it gets progressively brighter the further you get away from the camera. And so I kind of pick out a specific break in the image. Say for example here behind this building, you can smooth it out a little bit by holding down Alt and dragging one of these halves of the arrow, and then saying okay to that and just painting the fog in there, so you kind of get like a lot of separation just by doing that. And you do it a bunch of times and you can get a load of bespoke fog and really try to work out where you want to separate silhouettes, things like that, in a way that is actually art directable instead of just being something physically correct. We want something beyond that maybe. So similarly, I kind of work like that with the waterfalls as well. And for all of these waterfalls, I kind of used the Z-depth again to create masks, so I didn't have to manually cut them out every single time. And when it comes to this part of the creation of the image with the waterfalls, and as well as adding fog, and I think I've got some extra haze here, I'm almost working on de-emphasizing a lot of the detail that I've created up until this point through both scattering and through DMP. I mean, of course I still want it, but at this stage I'm trying to really just draw the viewer's attention to the main parts of the image. And in other parts, no one is going to question if there is detail or if there is not. The silhouette suggests so, and every other part of the image suggests that there is detail there. So I don't really need it because the viewer will just fill those blanks in their mind. And I mean, this is still detailed, but I don't need to draw their attention to these sort of areas of the image at first glance. I want these to be something extra that gets seen after the main focal points are seen, and there's no point in beating everyone over the head with it. And so I've got some extra waterfall images here and extra color corrections where I kind of play around with the mood and really try to define this sort of rain season, dank, wet look to the image and really make it hopefully unique. And then over the top of all of my CG renders as well, I start placing different bits of painting that don't conform at all to the geo. And so I've added a bunch of cables. Again, I'm kind of working to add directionality to the image. So these point in this direction, hopefully towards the center of the image. These sort of smooth the path along this area as the eye travels here. And I add like some extra detail on them as well. Next, I have airships, which were a lot of fun to add. And here's a little bit more about them, how I made them in 3D. Here are the spaceship models I created later on in the process. I originally hadn't planned to have any of these in the image, but eventually I kind of thought they would add something to the composition and would add more life to the overall feeling of the image. And I created these almost exactly the same way as I did the city. I just took one piece of base geometry and then scattered a bunch of other geos around it and randomized the points a few times each time I tried to create a new spaceship, and just kind of waited until I hit upon a lucky set of points that allowed me to have cool shapes that kind of look like spaceships. And I figured with how small and blurry they'd be on screen, I'd be able to get away with quite a lot and just apply a few textures and actually make them look like spaceships that were designed. And so as a matter of fact, I actually applied the exact same textures over these spaceships that I applied over the rest of the city and just cherry picked where I wanted little bits of color and information. A lot of these shanty textures of corrugated iron and tarps actually work quite well on the spaceships as well, and it was just sort of a way to cut down on the time it took me to make this image without having to manually texture them. And again, I kind of used the waterfalls to bring these into the image by helping set them in 3D space, by having them interact with the environment. And there's little bits, say for example like here, where I added a little bit of bespoke light and shadow right behind the spaceship. So basically, previously there was a little bit of light fog behind the front of the spaceship, which was already bright, and sort of dark area behind the dark end of the spaceship, and I kind of flipped that around, so that makes it stand out just a little bit more without being too obvious. So on top of that, I'm adding some additional fog near the top. I'm adding my God rays from earlier. I'm adding extra color correction and fixes and more haze. Again, I'm kind of trying to concentrate on just really bringing out the areas that I want, and drawing the viewer's attention. And I add a lot of things like lens dirt and of course birds for scale, which I always find help add life to the image and really just add extra little focuses for, little story beats, things like that. Another important thing is working up the edges. So if I zoom in a little bit more, by default CG edges tend to be kind of straight unless we work up the model quite a lot, but because this is just a still image, I end up doing a lot of extra work on the edges. So all of these, especially the ones that stand out in high contrast areas, I tend to kind of adjust quite liberally. Basically, I'm not really aiming for any specific look, I'm just kind of trying to break them up a little bit so that the viewer's eye doesn't catch it as something unnatural, but rather something that is irregular and it looks man-made. And it actually adds quite a lot to the image, even though it doesn't seem like it. So for the last stage of the adjustments, I add things such as light wrap, which really helps bring out the image and kind of is a subtle effect that makes it look a lot more realistic. I add little bits of fog that I'd previously forgotten. I've added motion blur to the spaceships just to make it more dynamic, even though the focus is on the environment itself. We can have these spaceships moving through space and really kind of making the image seem larger because they're coming from somewhere, they're going somewhere. Makes it feel a lot more like an alive world. Again, a couple more fixes on grading, and I always tend to add grain, but again, it's a good idea to use the blend diff feature to weigh it more heavily towards the shadowy parts of the image, as that is where the grain would be in a photo. So near the highlights, you don't want it as much, maybe. And another slight thing that I always tend to do is add a little bit of blur and add a little bit of sharpen on top of the blur. And I'm gonna explain why, because I guess it's not necessarily something obvious, but I find that it really helps sell the image. So for example, if I zoom in to maybe even more, maybe let's do 200%, you can see that some of these CG details and some of these photographic elements, say for example here is very obvious, you have very sharp CG and kind of slightly blurry photographic elements, and they don't match up together too well. But if I blur it by the tiniest amount, maybe even less than a pixel, all of these are kind of evened out because the sharpest edges are gonna become slightly blurry, whereas something that is already slightly blurry isn't gonna be affected as much, just to the naked eye, I guess. And then if you sharpen everything again by the tiniest bit, just 1 pixel, now everything is brought up to the same level of sharpness, and it's just a tiny little effect, but it does help quite a lot. After that, I always tend to add chromatic aberration. Again, you want it to be a very subtle effect, otherwise it kind of becomes, I guess, just a chromatic aberration in the movie or something like that. And you really don't want to draw people's attention to it. It's just something a little bit extra. And after blurring the background and adding a couple of last fixes, we are done. So the main takeaway I think from this is that you can use Clarisse to create really large-scale projects without needing a full team of people. It's a great way to do personal work because you don't get bogged down with boring tasks that take a long time to manually complete, and you can instead spend more time focusing on the interesting and fun aspects of creating an image. Perhaps this wouldn't be the way I would work within the industry, because if you have a sequence with a lot of shots within your project that all share the same environment, you might want to do things the more proper 3D way. However, for personal projects or for one-off shots, I feel like I can't really think of a better way to approach this kind of image, because this is the fastest and the most creative way that you can go about it. You don't get bogged down doing things that you don't want to be doing, and you can instead focus on all the really fun aspects of the image creation process. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I enjoyed it a lot as I was making it, and yeah, had a lot of fun. Hope you guys can create some cool stuff too using these ideas. Cheers.